We're going to move now to our next panel on, appropriately enough, on social justice activism in Maryland. And this is going to be led by Carl Snowden, who and I think it's safe to call Carl a legend. He's a longtime, and I mean that in the best way, Carl, longtime civil rights and community activist. He's a columnist. He is the convener of the Caucus of African American Leaders in Annapolis. And one thing I'm really impressed with is that 50 years ago, he led a boycott of Annapolis High School to protest the lack of African American teachers and curriculum, and was expelled. And that is a badge of honor. Carl is going to be joined today by Amber Green, who is the executive director of the Phoenix Youth Project, which is a nonprofit that supports youth in the arts in Wycomico County, and also by Chloe Jackson, who is the founder of the Brownsville Project and a leader of the Allegheny County Lynching Truth and Reconciliation Committee. And finally, also by Trey Murphy, who's deputy director of community organizing for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And previously, he was a field organizer of the at the ACLU. So, Carl, if you would kindly take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Will, and thank all that's watching, and particularly thanks to the men and women who will never know, those who have become buried in history, and attempt by some to lift them up and to remember them. There is a slogan which goes, say their names, and the whole purpose of that is to make sure that people know that those lives were important. One of the things that came out of the recent movement is people shouting and wearing t-shirts that say, I can't breathe. And many people associated that with Eric Gardner in New York and George Floyd, who both said, I can't breathe. But to set the record straight as we get into this panel discussion, the first time the words, I can't breathe, was uttered, they were not uttered in English. They were uttered in a multiple number of languages and dialects. It was Africans who were packed in cargo ships coming to America who literally could not breathe. And so I can't breathe is a phenomenon that is not new to those who understand history. It's why if you look at the Lincoln, if you look at the Statue of Liberty, you will find that language that says, give me your huddled masses who seek to breathe. So with that being the sort of context, I want to have our panel members address the issue as to 21st century activism. Where do you each see the nation going? And what do you think young people need to do to ensure that this legacy of struggle continues? We'll start with Ms. Green.
Thank you. That was great context for this conversation. I think we're at a point right now of no return. I think the young generation have officially set the tone of where things need to move forward. And I think that right now we're at a pivotal point to where we can either prepare the foundation, prepare and educate the young generations after us, that's coming after us, or we can repeat the cycle of what we've done generations before and kind of hold tight to the torch and not really pass it on, and not provide a space for where young people can actually learn how to be activists, how to be leaders. I think specifically with young people on the Lower Eastern Shore, I think it took a lot for young people to feel like they had a place, they had a voice. And I think that's been done because of systematic racism, just point blank. I think it's been carried out by, generations from our justice system to our education system to housing to job availability. And I think that we have a lot of young people who are in crisis, who are living through trauma. And instead of, letting that crisis and trauma bury them down, they're using that as fuel. So you see a lot of emotional young people. You see a lot of young adults who are emotional, who are angry, who are willing to say whatever they have to say to get the message across to those who have spent years of not listening, period. I feel like we're at a pivotal point, and at this point in time, I think the pathway is being laid out by young people, young adults. And I'm saying young people as young as ages 13. I have 12-year-olds who are in my organization who are leading protests, who are planning protests. And I have no right to tell them that this is not their fight, especially when they have their parents who are being threatened to be deported. They have their parents who are being incarcerated, being railroaded by our local justice system. So that's where I was saying I think we're at a pivotal point. I think young people have a very important role in this fight, and I think it's really up to the older generations, those who are ahead of them, to really lay down the foundation and provide this education that is needed for things to happen.
Thank you. Ms. Jackson. Sorry.
Yes. Hi, thank you for allowing me to be here with you all today to talk about these very important topics. And I echo and amplify everything that Amber Green is saying. You know, as a person who is not young, but relatively young, to hear it be told by my mother and grandmother, who were both activists, I see myself learning from both sides as I look at the work of those who were leaders in the civil rights movement and thereafter. And then, you know, I look at those who are coming up behind me, and that passion and that fire that young people have. I think that that's something that we all need to hear and listen to. There's a level of bravery and resoluteness that young people have always had, and they've always been the leaders and the kindling to our fire for our movement. And I think that that's something that we always need to keep in the forefront, because at the end of the day, what we're fighting for is their future. And so we have to take our lead from them. And that's really what I seek to do in my work, is honor the past, remember the past, know the history of the past, and then also look at the present state as evidence through our young people, and how are they affected by this, and how do I listen to them and take what they're giving me and that information from the past to make effective change.
Thank you. Chair Trey Murphy.
Hello, good, I guess it's afternoon now. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so happy to be here, and it's so good to see you again, Carl. Yeah, you know, I definitely echo everything that my two panelists, colleagues have said. The only thing that I would add is that I think that we are really right now in this moment at a point where everything is on the lines, right? And I don't say that lightly, right? I do not sort of make light of the moment that we're in right now. And because everything is on the line, I think we're also at a point where young people, just as Amber was saying, young people are leading a charge, right? Young people, they're the ones that are actively turning up on the streets right now. They're the ones that are actively saying that we need something new, right? We need something better. We need something that is different from the same old, same old. And so, you know, the way that I sort of describe this moment to folks whenever I'm talking with folks right now, is that I think that there are sort of three core visionary things that I view as happening right now in this moment. One is that there's the holding of the line, right? There's the holding of the line for and protecting of what little bit of democracy and illusions of freedom that Black people have, right? There's literally the holding of that line. Because of Trumpism, because of COVID-19, because of the racist past of this country, because of this system of white supremacy, right? It has propelled us in this moment to say that we need to hold the lines for what little bit we have right now, right? So that's sort of just like one avenue in this moment that young people are really sort of helping to lead the charge in this global uprising, is what I call it. The second is that folks are actively calling for the abolition of white supremacy, right? And what that oftentimes means is the abolition of systems that uphold white supremacy, right? Like that's a call right now in this moment. And it's a very uncomfortable call because it's something that hasn't been done before, right? And it's something that isn't new, but young people are leading that charge. They're saying that we don't want police that have come out of slave catching, right? We don't want police that have historically murdered and lynched our folks, right? And so that's a valid call. I think that, you know, there's arguments on both sides as to if not police, what else? And I think that we can get to that argument, but I think that that second call nonetheless is important. And then the third and final call that I'll say really quickly is just something, a philosophy that I've gotten from my mentor, Bob Moses, who was a Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee field secretary. And he talks about this difference between constitutional people and constitutional property. Constitutional people being white men with property during the founding of this country, and constitutional property oftentimes being Black people and slaves, right? And so in this moment, a part of the call and the mandate right now is also building a world where everyone is a constitutional person, right? And no one is constitutional property, right? And that means that we have to address, just as folks are doing with the Lynching Commission, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, right? That means that we have to address the ugliness of this country's past, right? And say that we have to get to the root causes of the doctrines that have actively said that Black people are constitutional properties and therefore our lives are expendable, right? And so when police shoots us, when white supremacist organizations coordinates with the police in the Jacob Blake case in Kenosha, right? Then that is just like unacceptable because we all are constitutional people, and no longer Black people are thought of as constitutional property. So I'll stop there because I've been talking.
Yeah. Well, let me interject and really raise a question with the three of you. Let me put it in context. Oftentimes people think that this generational divide is something new. And I just want to give you a context. You had mentioned Bob Mosey, as well as SNCC. And I remember reading a story about Martin Luther King Jr., who was at the old age of 29, 30. He met a young man named Stokely Carmichael, who was at that time in his teen. And Stokely Carmichael told Martin Luther King Jr. that young people needed to take over the movement because he was old and it was time for new tactics. He went on to tell Dr. King that his grandfather, Stokely's grandfather, ran from white people, literally ran from them. His father ran from white people, he said. And then Stokely Carmichael said, this generation is not running anymore. This is the generation that will confront and deal with this system. And it seems that oftentimes we think, not knowing the history, that it's the first time that young people have challenged the system and challenged the leadership. So what I would ask the three of you, what do you see different that you will bring? What tactics you will use that are different from those in the past? In the past, the tactics was to organize, mobilize, and get people out to vote, to use the vote as a tool. The tactic in the past was to organize and mobilize and energize communities and dramatize the plight of people of color. What are the new tactics you see coming that previous generations have not used? Either one of you.
Amber's up.
One of the tactics that I definitely see that's being utilized by young people is social media, is the internet, our phones. I think our phones is pretty much our way of protecting ourselves. Our phones have become our microphones, it's become our security cameras, it's become our quick way to organize quickly. Through Twitter. I know I've been in many protests and many organizing things where a lot of the organizing was done through private chats, not on social media and different things like that. I think technology has been a really big tool in working and activating young people. I would say another thing that's different with young people, and I would say specifically talking with young people on the Eastern Shore, I think the difference or the tactic that's being used right now is, what else can they do to me? What's left? I've already been locked up. I've already had a bout with, the police. I've already, lost my house to eviction. What else can they do? At this point, I might as well go outside and act a fool, because if I act a fool, then something's going to get changed. Somebody's going to hear what I have to say. And so I think it's that by any means necessary that we heard of growing up, I think this generation is feeling it, because by any means necessary, we have nothing left to lose. I just turned 30, and when I gave birth to my son, something switched in me because I gave birth to a Black young boy. And I brought him home the week of Philando Castile and the Dallas police shootings. That woke me up, and I have not been back to sleep. And I think that crisis, that trauma that I think that a lot of adults are trying to shield our young generation from, you can't shield us from it. We're living through it. So I think the new tactics that I see is that young people are channeling their emotions. They're not scared of anger. They're not scared of depression or mental health. They're utilizing new information to combat, white supremacy, but also taking back what they learned into the community and within the Black community to help us grow within ourselves. So there's nothing else to lose.
Let me interject.
So that's what I think is the new tactics. Of course, social media and the internet, but it's also that feeling of what else can happen.
Okay, so technology is what I heard you say, using the new tools of technology. Chloe.
So,
what are you going to do differently?
Differently, what I see differently and what I have aimed to do differently personally myself is, really drawing on a quote from Audre Lorde, which is, your silence won't save you. And so to be silent or to worry about what I'm speaking and saying that it might offend or upset someone is not abolitionist or liberation-based behavior. Liberation-based behavior starts for myself personally of speaking truth to power and saying what needs to be said. It's also about what Trey was mentioning about changing the systems, deconstructing systems, and not playing to the middle. So for instance, I see a comment about how do we allay fears? I don't think that we allay people's fears. I think that we positively channel that fear into action to do something different. And when we say do something different, not reform, but to deconstruct the systems that have never served or worked for us, and being willing to radically reimagine those systems in a way that speaks to all of our intersections. And the final thing that I'll say is changing language, taking back narratives, so important. Even the change of using the word uprising instead of riot, right? Or massacre, and when we're talking about Tulsa, making the language very specific to what is actually occurring and marking that. And then also upending other systems that seek to stall Black liberation. So systems of patriarchy, colorism, or any other system of oppression that really speaks to the intersections within the Black community and then within the human community. How do we deconstruct those internally while we also address liberation for Black folks and ending racial terror?
Thank you. Trey, what are the new tactics that you see that's different from those that have been used in the past? We've got technology. We now have the notion that we can change the language of describing the narrative. What's your view?
Yeah, I think that this is just a brilliant panel. So I am enjoying every aspect of this and you all. I would add two other things, and then I'll resurface something from the sort of civil rights and Black Power movement. So the first new thing, and I think somebody mentioned this out the chat, so you saw one of my new ideas, but this idea around decentralized leaders, right? I'm a decentralized movement. And so, I always frame this in the context of Ella Baker, who I believe was the fairy godmother of grassroots community organizing in many respects for me. And she talked about one of her famous quotes that says, strong people don't need strong leaders, right? And so how do we get up to the work of building strong people, right? She didn't say that there's not a need for leaders, but she said that we don't need strong leaders because we are actively building the capacity of everyone inside of our collectives, inside of our political homes. And so sort of that's one new thing that the movement is testing out right now, right? They're testing out how do we be a leaderful movement, and what does that look like? So that's one new thing. The second thing, and this is not to say that this wasn't done during the civil rights movement, but I think it sort of happened afterwards, which is the archiving of history, right? So how do we tell narratives from our vantage point so oftentimes history is told from the side of the oppressors, right, and not the side of the oppressed. And so how do we actively archive in real time right now the work that is happening that is going to hopefully get us to some level of liberation or freedom for Black people, right? And so that is something that I think is new and is different. Is that we're having conversations. We're like, how do we archive? How do we tell our stories, right? To the language piece that Chloe, I'm hoping that I'm saying your name right, but to the language piece that you were saying, right? Like, how do we make sure that that language, that new language that we're creating, because Black people are brilliant, we're always inventing something, right? So how do we make sure that that new language is archived, right? And it's told from our vantage point around what it means. So that's the second thing. And then the third thing is something that happened all around the Civil Rights Movement, but particularly in SNCC, in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee with Fannie Lou Hamer, when she led the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, is how do we build independent political power, right? Black political power. What does that actually mean? And the last thing that I'll say just on that piece is that I have conversations with folks all across the country in the movement, and we joke, but it's a very serious thing around if we achieve liberation tomorrow, if we achieve freedom, if we tore down these structures, whatever you want to call it, right? If we achieve that tomorrow, would we be ready to govern ourselves? And the ultimate answer is no, right? Because we haven't built that independent political power. We haven't begun to test out these structures, right? And I think that is different now, is that we are beginning to try to test out things on a much micro level. But the question still remains, can we build independent political power so that we can govern ourselves? And I think that that is fair, that's valid, and that is a new level of something that our ancestors started, that I think that we have to begin to carry more and more into the future and into these conversations.
Well, let me say this to you, Trey, and others listening. What you just laid out is really not new. If you knew, the movement of South Africa is exactly what you just talked about. Angola, Mozambique. Whenever there's liberation, you've got to be able to build the infrastructure. And it's a process. Nothing starts off automatic. But here's the point I'd like to share with the three of you. And something I've been saying to people, and something I would ask that you give some consideration to. Generally, if you would ask people, Black people, do they think Minister Farrakhan, as an example, is a smart man? Most people would say yes. If you ask them, do you think Reverend Jesse Jackson is a smart man? Most people would say yes. If you ask them, is President Barack Obama a smart man? Most people would say yes. And my question then would be to those who say yes. They all three live in Chicago. Chicago is experiencing one of the bloodshed. I mean, people dying in the streets. Minister Farrakhan, Jesse Jackson, nor President Obama meet on a regular basis, talk about how they in their respective positions can make America better. One of the things I'm hoping that young people will learn is the lessons of the past, the mistakes that have been made. You talked about decentralized leadership. It's always been decentralized leadership, in my opinion. Kind of just know the history of the country. There are many men and women who you have never heard of on a national level who made great changes in this nation. What I would strongly recommend that you do is look at the mistakes of the people of the past. Look at the young people who came forward in the beginning. Angela Davis was 26 years old when she first came into national prominence. Martin Luther King Jr. was 26 years old. Huey Newton was a 22-year-old college student. So young people have emerged, have been part of this movement, and have often taken leadership positions. But they're like the generations before them had made mistakes. And that's what I want to focus this next question for the three of you. As you look at the national leadership, I grew up in a generation that had a Malcolm X, that had a Martin Luther King Jr., that had a Fannie Lou Hamer, that had these giants, James Baldwin, and so many more, who kind of gave me direction and some idea of what was possible. As you look at your generation, and if someone asked you, if you had to choose someone that you think of as your leader, who would it be and why? And this time, Trey, we'll start with you and ask each person to be brief so we can get this in, because I have two other quick questions. Trey, who's your leader nationally?
Thank you. Yeah. So in terms of this generation,
Yeah.
one of the people that I respect the most is a brother by the name of Montega Simmons, who is based out of St. Louis and Ferguson. I'm not sure that he has sort of any high level of national prominence, but part of the reason why I respect him is because, you know, as an organizer, part of my philosophy is that half of the job is showing up, right? The other half is actually being useful, but half of the job is showing up, right? And this is a brother who constantly shows up wherever he's at. And the second person that I'll just mention is a sister out of the South, the Deep South, in Tennessee, by the name of Ashley Woodard Henderson. And so she is the first Black women executive director at the Highlander Center for Education and Research, which has been a meeting house for the civil rights movement. It was the first place that John Lewis had his first integrated meal at. And, you know, same thing, like half of the job is showing up, but these folks are brilliant, both strategists, tacticians, and they bring folks into the movement. So,
let me go to Chloe real quickly. Chloe.
Yes. So
who you see as your leader?
So I'm checking for Angela Davis, who you just mentioned, because she's about global activism, which I think is so important. And so she would be that for me, and also because of her work in abolitionist theory.
Great. Amber. Who do you see?
I'm actually going to say Angela Davis as well. Yeah, I'm going to say Angela Davis as well. She's definitely been someone that I refer to a lot as far as reading her works. I was able to see her speak in person at the Women's March, the first Women's March, and that kind of really empowered me a lot. So I take a lot of her teachings. But honestly, if I have to be honest, I don't think I truly have one, simply because I feel as though one thing to fix mistakes is to not centralize one individual, because I think humans make mistakes. I think we have to look at movements and in its entirety.
Well, Minister Farrakhan is approaching in his 90s. Jesse Jackson just turned 79. Congresswoman Maxine Waters is 80. And you can go at the national leadership. You find most of these people have reached a point where they will be soon leaving the scene. And so you young people will have an opportunity to be able to fill a vacuum. But I just want to share why it's important to look at history, learn from history, and don't assume that those tactics don't work. Do any one of the three of you know how the Bell company in New York City got integrated? Anybody have any idea how that happened? There was a man, and I just want to share this with you very quickly. And think about this generation and the tactics that you have available to you if you organize. There was a man in New York City who saw that African Americans wasn't being hired by the telephone company. He happened to be a very prominent preacher in New York City. So on a particular day in 1943, he got all of his members of his congregation, very large congregation, to go to the telephone company on the same day to pay their bills. In those days, the bill might have been $5 or $3, but he had everybody pay their bill in pennies. It tied up the system for days because they had to count all these pennies. And of course, they quickly talked to the Reverend Adam Clayton Powell, who would later become the first councilman of New York City and later congressman, to have Blacks be hired. I would think that young people ought to look at the tactics that have been used in the past to be able to uplift those tactics to the present and be able to deal with the system. I'm very familiar with what's going on the Eastern Shore, for example, where there are places on the Eastern Shore in towns and cities where African Americans are not represented at all in government. And yet there are things that can be done. So my last question to the three of you is, if you had to give your advice to people on this panel, many of them much older than you, What would you tell the people on this panel and people who are watching who have a different generation? What are the kind of support you think you need as you move forward in your leadership role? And this time we'll start with Amber. Amber, what do you need? What can we do on Eastern Shore to help you with what you're trying to do?
For one, let the young generation fail, because without failing, we can't learn anything. I think a lot of our elders, a lot of those who are in decision-making positions, they are scared to lose what they've worked really hard for. But then from a young person's perspective, we don't see what you worked hard for. We know that there is definitely a pathway that you've created, but it hasn't really trickled down to us. And so we want to get a little bit more. And so I think it's, let us fail. Let us fall a little bit. Give us the space to become leaders, because we've accept the older generation's mistakes time and time again. And so I think it's kind of just let us fail.
Okay, Trey.
You know, I'm really a Black Southern Baptist preacher at heart. But there's a saying that I always say around, like, the doors of the movement is open, right? And so in terms of what I need, one of the things that I find increasingly difficult is when folks aren't connected to political homes. So, you know, you have things like the Caucus of American Leaders, these great organizations, right? But oftentimes people only view their role as like giving $5 or $10 or some like monetary resources, which is important. Like, I take that too. You know, my organizations need money too. But I think there are many different roles beyond just like people being in the streets protesting, right? That this movement encompass. And so personally, what I really need is folks to find a political home, discover your contribution, build deep intentional relationships with everyone that you encounter. And from those points of relationships, move those people to action and get them involved in this work, because it will take the totality of us building this multiracial, multi-class movement that has to be rooted in anti-racism and destroying anti-Blackism.
Thank you, Glory.
So I think the most important thing is, and I'll summarize it in do the work. So in Allegheny County, for example, we have started caucusing, which is an age-old tool, but we've really flipped that with also the newer generation by having that led by Black leadership. So we've been able to form a white caucus that gets together, and they really work to mobilize and support the strategy that is devised by Black leadership. And if anyone knows Allegheny County, that's truly revolutionary for that location. And it's worked really well. And so I would say to people, be willing to try that new process. Be willing to step in and just trust the process. And to speak to Amber, let us fail. But in letting us fail, also be willing to try something new.
Well, let me, before turning this back to Will, I just want to share with the three of you this. It might be helpful for you to have an intergenerational discussion with activists of previous activists who've been involved in struggle. On the Eastern Shore, I'm very familiar with men and women who made huge sacrifices on the Eastern Shore to change what exists there and other parts of the state. I had the great pleasure early in my life of meeting James Baldwin, and I met him in Baltimore. And I met James Baldwin when he was speaking at Hopkins. And it was a predominantly white audience. He had just finished giving this marvelous speech. And there was this hot topic going on at the time. The topic was a man named Elbridge Cleaver, who was a member of the Black Panther Party, Minister of Information for the Black Panther Party, had written this incredible article that just savagely attacked James Baldwin. Said that James Baldwin couldn't speak for Black people because he was gay. And as a result of being gay, he shouldn't speak for Black people. And I happened to be in the audience. I worked for a local radio station. I wanted desperately to get the reaction to James Baldwin, what his reaction was to that allegation on the part of Elbridge Cleaver. And in those days, this is in the 70s, it was not appropriate to talk about the sexuality. So I must sound like a fool trying to get this question. I was 19 years old. And James Baldwin was so kind. He knew what I was trying to say. And he said, what you want to know is, am I gay? And do Black people who are gay, are they able to speak for people of color? And we got to remember the times. This is in the 70s, where being open and gay was not something that people talked about. And then Baldwin gave me an education that I have never forgotten. He went on and shared with me the men and women who had made this huge contribution, who happened to be lesbians, who happened to be gay. I didn't know it. I had no idea of this. And when Baldwin was finished with his statement, he said something to me that long stuck, and I'll share it with you in my concluding remarks. Young people, do not be afraid to explore who you are. Do not be afraid to tell people who you are. But more importantly, be willing to listen. And Baldwin's point was that all youth, every generation, is nothing different but any generation. There's a tendency for us not to listen. And when we start to listen, we learn. And when we learn, we change. So thank you, Will, for this opportunity to be a part of this dynamic panel. These three young people impressed me greatly. In them, I see a future that's bright. The one thing Amber said that I just love, that by any means necessary, I sort of remember that quote, where it comes from. It's that spirit that I think will change America. And on November 3rd, for everybody that's listening, what I would say to people, what's on the ballot is not two men running for the presidency. What is on the ballot is the future of this democracy as we know it. And we should do everything we can to use one of those old tactics that have made a difference. Try to get people out to vote and have their voices be heard. Thank you again, Will.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Carl. And thank you to Amber and Chloe and Trey. That was, I'm almost shaking. That was so, it's hard for me to imagine so much wisdom from people who are so young. And I can't tell you how much I really appreciate it. It was really wonderful. I just wanted to add, your comments about the role of memory. And I just, it makes me think of this story that I tell, I know too often, but the Greeks did not have a word for truth, for all of their rationality and everything else. The word that they had was alethe, which means not forgotten. And I think that is what this effort and this organization and this enterprise is about. We are not letting people forget. And then that way we're telling the truth. And we know, as Brian tells us, that we can't have reconciliation until we know the truth. So thank you, everyone, for coming today. Thank you to all our panelists and speakers. It was a magnificent day. It really memorable. And I'm so grateful to you all for being here and for compelling Maryland to face the facts of this dark part of our history so that we can all move forward together.